Clara Bennett stood at the bedroom window and watched the sun climb over the hills of Beverly Hills, the light arriving in long, unhurried stripes across the marble floor. 5 years. 5 years since she had stood in a different kind of light, the flashbulb kind, the orchestrated kind, and said the words that were supposed to mean something. I do. She remembered the ceremony with the particular clarity reserved for things that leave marks. The dress, impeccable and borrowed from someone else's idea of perfect. The cameras, the guests, the flowers arranged by someone who had been paid to care about flowers. Nathan Collins, standing at the altar with his hands clasped and his expression composed, and his eyes communicating something she had understood, even then, with the specific intelligence of the heart that the mind tries to argue down. Those eyes had said deal. Not love. Not even the beginning of love. A strategic arrangement between two families, one ascending, one drowning, sealed with rings and rehearsed vows and champagne that nobody drank with any real joy. The Bennett family company had been weeks from collapse. The Collins family had won an alliance. Clara had been the bridge, dressed in white. 5 years later, she stood at a window in a mansion that had everything money could acquire and nothing that money actually couldn't, and she was, as she had been for most of those 5 years, entirely alone. Breakfast was laid before 8. She ate it by herself. Nathan appeared occasionally, moving through the dining room like a weather system that had somewhere else to be. A cold good morning, eyes already on the phone, already elsewhere, the real world apparently existing only on that glowing screen. She had learned not to wait for more. She had learned, in fact, not to wait for much of anything, which was why, on that particular morning, when she descended the marble staircase and found him actually sitting at the table, actually present, she stopped 2 steps from the bottom and recalibrated. "Good morning," he said, without looking up. His voice was calm. It was always calm, but there was something underneath it that she couldn't immediately identify. A frequency she hadn't heard before. "Good morning," Clara replied, applying the caution the situation clearly called for. "Did something happen?" He set his cup down with the measured deliberateness of someone who has been practicing a sentence. "There's a gala tonight. I want you to come with me." Clara stood very still. 5 years of silence, and then a gala. "With me?" she said, because she needed to hear the clarification. "Yes." He didn't quite meet her eyes. "It's important for the company. Be ready by 7. She studied him for a moment, looking for the angle, for the version of this that made cold, calculated sense. She found something in the set of his jaw that she couldn't fully read, something that suggested this wasn't entirely as simple as he was making it sound. "All right," she said, smoothing the uncertainty from her voice. "I'll be ready." Nathan nodded and left the room with his usual purposeful stride. As he passed, his cologne, the same one since their wedding day, reached her more clearly than it usually did. She stood at the bottom of the stairs after he was gone and tried to understand why that felt significant. The day moved slowly. Clara sat through the attentions of a hairstylist who worked in comfortable silence while Clara stared at the mirror and tried not to spin in circles. The red dress she chose made her eyes look darker than usual. Her mother's pearl necklace settled against her collarbone like a reminder of a different life, a life in which she had been fully visible to the people who mattered. "You were born to be loved, not displayed." Her mother's voice, always there when she needed it least and most simultaneously. Clara took a measured breath. Tonight could be the beginning of something. Or there could be another careful performance for an audience that would never know the difference. At 7 precisely, a knock at the bedroom door. When she opened it, Nathan stood in a dark suit that had been chosen by someone with exceptional taste, his expression slightly off its usual axis. He looked at her for a fraction of a second longer than he needed to. "Ready?" he asked, and there was something fractionally unsteady in it. "Yes." They walked side by side through the hallway, their footsteps on the marble producing a sound like a conversation neither of them was having. In the limousine, he studied his phone. Clara watched the city slide past the window. their reflections overlaid on the dark glass, occupying the same space without touching. This is what we are, she thought. Reflections that never meet. Then, into the silence, without preamble. It's important that you stay close to me tonight. People will want to meet you. Clara turned. He was looking not at her, but somewhere past her, out the opposite window, as though the sentence had embarrassed him slightly. All right, she said. He didn't elaborate. The distance between them, measured in inches on the limousine seat, felt considerably larger than that. The event hall was the kind of room designed to make people feel both important and slightly inadequate. Golden light, the murmur of serious money, the scent of champagne, and careful ambition. When they entered, a small ripple moved through the crowd. Nathan Collins, with his wife, the one almost no one had ever actually seen. Clara felt the weight of the attention settle on her like a garment she hadn't chosen. She kept her posture, kept her expression, kept moving. When Nathan turned to introduce her, his hand briefly at the small of her back. This is my wife, Clara Bennett Collins. He smiled. It was small and quick, and she was almost entirely certain, genuine. Something shifted in her chest without her permission. They moved through the room. Nathan guided her through the current of executives and investors with a proprietary ease that she wasn't sure how to interpret. She kept pace, smiled at the appropriate moments, said the appropriate things, until a voice from behind them, warm and direct. Mrs. Collins? I'm Alex Carter with the Westfield Group. The man who turned toward her had an easy quality about him, the kind of person who makes a room slightly more comfortable simply by being in it. His smile was genuine and unhurried. Finally meeting the most mysterious woman in Los Angeles, he said. Clara felt a laugh arrive without her planning it. Mysterious is a generous interpretation. I think the more accurate word is reclusive. He laughed easily. Nathan, beside her, maintained an expression of such careful neutrality that it functioned almost as its own statement. Alex was warm and curious and entirely devoid of the performing quality that characterized most conversations in rooms like this one. He asked her genuine questions and listened to the actual answers, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. Seen. The sensation was simple and devastating. Someone in this room was simply looking at her, responding to her, treating her like a person who had interior dimensions worth being curious about. With each exchange, Nathan grew quieter. His posture remained impeccable. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes had shifted into something watchful and cold in a way that Clara noticed without knowing what to do with. Later, when Alex stepped away to take a call, Nathan leaned toward her. You seem to be enjoying yourself. Perhaps, Clara said, meeting his gaze steadily, because someone finally wanted to talk to me. Nathan looked away. The muscle in his jaw moved once. The dinner proceeded with the surface ease of these events. Toasts, laughter, the choreography of people who have practiced being charming in groups. Clara found herself animated in a way she'd forgotten was available to her. She spoke and people responded. She made a remark and earned real laughter. She was not, for the first time in years, merely decorative. Nathan watched it all. His eyes tracked her movements across the table and through the room with an attention she had spent 5 years desperately wanting and now found, turned toward her with this particular quality, deeply unsettling. At the end of the evening, Alex returned to say his goodbyes. It was a genuine pleasure meeting you, Clara. I hope we'll have the chance to speak again. Before she could respond, Nathan stepped forward with the smooth inevitability of a move that had been calculated. I doubt it. My wife has a full schedule. The silence that followed was inhabited by Clara's perfectly still expression and Alex's brief, polite recalibration. In the car home, the air had changed. Clara kept her eyes on the passing city and cataloged the shift without naming it. The silence was charged in a way the earlier silence had not been. When the car stopped at the mansion and she turned to say something neutral and transitional, Nathan was already watching her. His eyes were different, Not the cold dismissal she had learned to expect, not the practiced blankness. Something else. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, almost human. "You surprised a lot of people tonight," he said. "Including you?" The question came out softly, almost involuntarily. A pause. "Including me." He stepped out before she could respond. Clara sat in the empty car for a moment, hands folded in her lap, trying to take the measure of what had just happened. She wasn't sure whether what she was feeling was the first stirring of hope or the first stirring of something she should be considerably more careful about. She went upstairs, past the mirror in her bedroom, and stopped. Looked. For the first time in 5 years, the woman looking back at her appeared to be someone who existed. Fully. Who occupied space and generated presence, and was capable of producing a genuine laugh in a crowded room. She was also frightened by what that meant. From his own window across the hall, Nathan stood in the dark and looked out at the city lights without seeing them. He couldn't have named what was moving through him with any precision. But one thing had clarified itself, sharp and irrevocable, in the light of that gala room. For the first time, he had truly looked at her. The following morning brought its second consecutive impossibility. It was almost endearing. Almost. The next several days produced a catalog of small, inexplicable events. Nathan began appearing in rooms he had no established reason to be in. The living room, while she was reading. The kitchen, while she was making tea. Once, she looked up from her desk to find him standing in her office doorway, simply standing there with no visible agenda. "Can I help you?" she asked. "No, just passing through." "Nathan, this is my office. It's a dead end. There's nowhere to pass through to." He cleared his throat, looked briefly like a man caught doing something he couldn't explain, and retreated. Clara sat with her pen in her hand and stared at the empty doorway. Is he ill? She thought. Did he sustain some kind of head injury I wasn't informed about? On Thursday morning, she walked into the kitchen to find a cup of coffee already sitting on the counter, made with precisely the right amount of milk. Her preferred proportion, which she had never once mentioned to him because there had never been occasions to mention things to him. She looked around the kitchen. Nathan. He appeared in the doorway with the studied casualness of someone who has been standing just out of sight. Yes. Did you make this? I was making mine. I made yours as well. It's not significant. Clara picked up the cup the way you pick up a suspicious object whose properties you haven't yet established. In 5 years of marriage, you have never made coffee for me. Something moved across his face. I should have done it sooner. She stood there holding the cup. The coffee was perfect. Unervingly, precisely perfect. She took a sip, and the fact that it was exactly right bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. "Thank you," she said, after a pause she was aware of. "Yes," said Nathan, and left. Clara stood in the kitchen with an excellent cup of coffee and the distinct sensation of being in a story she hadn't been given the full text of. That afternoon, her phone lit up with Alex Carter's name. She stood looking at the screen for a moment. There was nothing complicated about answering. He was a perfectly decent person who had been kind to her in a room full of people who hadn't been, when Nathan walked in. "Who's calling?" Clara nearly dropped the phone. "You startled me." "Saw the..." His eyes were fixed on the device. "Who is it?" "Alex Carter. From the event." Something shifted in Nathan's expression, a shadow moving across controlled water. "Are you going to answer?" "I hadn't decided." "Why does it matter?" "It doesn't." "Then why are you looking at me like I'm about to transmit proprietary information to a competitor?" "I just think you should be thoughtful about who you become involved with." Clara looked at him. "Involved with, Nathan?" "The man said hello to me at a public event. We're not eloping." "I am aware." "Are you jealous?" "No." The word arrived too fast, with too much emphasis, undermining its own credibility entirely. Clara studied him for a moment with the consideration she might give a genuinely puzzling development. "If you have something to say, I'd genuinely encourage you to say it. This current approach, the hovering, the appearing in doorways, the coffee, it's making me feel like I'm in a psychological thriller." Nathan took a breath, appeared to be on the threshold of something, and then stepped back from it. He left without answering. The call went to voicemail. Over the following days, Alex's messages arrived at considerate intervals. Light, friendly, nothing that crossed any line. Friendly overtures from a person who had clearly found their conversation worthwhile. Clara read them without responding. Nathan, inexplicably, always seemed to know when her phone had produced a new message, as though he had developed a specialized form of perception specifically calibrated to this purpose. Him again, he asked once, appearing at her elbow in the way he had recently taken to doing. Nathan, are you monitoring my phone? No, I noticed things. You didn't notice anything for 5 years. I should have noticed sooner. He said it simply, without the quality of a rehearsed line, and it landed differently than she expected. She looked at him directly. What is happening with you? Genuinely. Nothing. He paused, visibly searching for the rest of the sentence, and then her phone rang. Alex again. Nathan's expression changed in a way that was clearly legible and clearly involuntary, jaw tightening, eyes going somewhere darker and more controlled. Before Clara had processed what was happening, Nathan reached out and picked up her phone. What are you doing? She reached for it and missed. Nathan had already answered. Hello. Yes. This is Nathan Collins, Clara's husband. A brief silence, during which his expression remained rigidly composed. She's unavailable. No, not later. Thank you. He ended the call and set the phone on the table with the precision of someone placing an object they're trying not to throw. Clara stood completely still for the duration of 2 full breaths. You did not just do that. I did. You had absolutely no right. I have every right. You're my wife. I'm your wife on paper, Nathan. The words came out with a force she hadn't planned, carrying 5 years of compression behind them. On paper, you have never treated me like a wife. You have looked through me, walked past me, and eaten breakfast in rooms I wasn't in for 5 years. You have never asked me a question that wasn't logistical. You have never looked at me for more than the time it took to confirm I was present. Her voice had risen past the register she normally allowed herself. And now some man who showed me basic human courtesy for 40 minutes at a work event has your jaw clenched and your hands in my phone. Don't talk to me about rights. I don't want to lose you. His voice came out low and urgent, as though it had bypassed the usual filters entirely. The room went very quiet. Clara stared at him. I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you. He said again, with the same quality, raw and unguarded, the voice of someone who has stopped managing an admission and is simply making it. That's what I've been trying to say. That's what I haven't been able to say. You don't get to do that. Her own voice had gone quiet now, quieter than the anger, which was worse. You can't be absent for 5 years and then say something like that and expect it to land like a simple truth. I know I can't. Then why? Because it is the truth. And I can't pretend anymore that it isn't. Clara looked at him, at the vulnerability in his face that she had never seen there before, at the loosened posture of a man who has put down something heavy, and felt the tears arrive, not from softness, but from the accumulated weight of everything that had preceded this moment. She turned and walked to her room. She locked the door and sat on the floor with her back against it, and her hands pressed to her face, and her heart was pounding in a way it had not done in 5 years. She did not know, sitting there on the cool floor, whether what was beginning was something she should move toward or something she should protect herself from. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, the question had become genuinely worth asking. The next morning, she woke with swollen eyes and the particular heaviness of a head that has not had enough sleep. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror without particular kindness. Wonderful. I now look like a sleep-deprived raccoon. She went downstairs expecting the usual. The empty kitchen, the set table with its single-place setting, the silence that filled a mansion this size the way water fills a vessel. What she found instead was Nathan, in the kitchen, wearing an apron with the focused expression of someone attempting something they have clearly underestimated. Clara stopped on the bottom step and questioned her own perception. "Good morning," he said, producing a smile that was genuinely trying. "You're wearing an apron." "I am." "Why?" "Because I'm cooking." Clara approached with the careful steps of someone who has learned that unexpected situations sometimes require careful steps. On the stove, something was cooking in a way that suggested it had once been an omelet and was now something else entirely. "Is that salvageable?" He glanced at the pan. "It was supposed to be. It's not going the way I planned." "Nathan, it's the color of charcoal." "I know what color it is. Omelets are not this color." He turned off the stove with the expression of someone acknowledging a defeat. "I wanted to do something good." Clara pressed her lips together against the smile that was threatening to arrive. "Good would have been coffee. You make excellent coffee. I wanted to impress you." "Well," she looked at the pan, "you've accomplished something. Impressed is one word for it. Alarmed is another." He removed the apron with the dignity of a man absorbing a necessary loss. "I'm not good at this. At cooking, that's evident. At a pause. At being close to you." The smile she'd been suppressing retreated. Her throat did something complicated. She kept her tone light by effort. Setting the kitchen on fire is certainly a non-conventional approach to that problem. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. They stood in the kitchen while the smoke cleared, and it was ridiculous. The entire situation was objectively ridiculous, and somehow that made it easier to be in than the 5 years of careful distance had been. They opened windows together, waving dish towels at the smoke alarm until it relented, moving around each other in the small space with a new, cautious proximity. "Are you wearing cologne?" Clara asked, not because she needed to know, but because it had arrived in her awareness, and she was done pretending not to notice things. Nathan froze, mid-towel wave. "I am. You don't usually wear cologne before 9 in the morning." "Maybe I should have been wearing it." She looked at him. He looked at the window. Outside, the morning moved on without concern for either of them. "You're behaving very strangely, Nathan." "I know. It's making me feel like something is either very right or very wrong, and I can't determine which. It should probably make you feel like both." She stared at him for another moment, then went to get her own coffee, because some things a person simply has to do for themselves. The rest of the day produced its own collection of small, disorienting moments. Nathan offered to drive her to the salon. She declined. He offered again. She got in the car. "Your hair looks different," he said, after a silence that had been building towards some kind of observation. "It has been exactly the same for 3 years." "Oh, well, it looks nice." "Thank you," she said, with the specific tone of someone who is not sure what they're thanking. "That dress. Is it new?" "Nathan, you saw me wear this dress at the gala." "Right. Still looks nice." Clara looked out the passenger window and allowed herself a private moment of bewilderment. Is this what he's like when he's trying? She thought. Is this the effort? It was. And there was something about its imperfection, its obvious difficulty, that made it harder to dismiss than a polished performance would have been. That evening she arrived at the dining room doorway to find candles lit. A set table. Nathan standing to one side, slightly formal, with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing this. "What is this?" she asked. "Dinner." He pulled out a chair. "Please sit." "Nathan, please." She sat, watching him with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read between the lines and is now finding the lines themselves confusing. The candles flickered. Nathan sat across from her and looked nervous in a way that seemed entirely foreign to his face. "All right," Clara said, folding her hands on the table. "Talk to me." The coffee, the apron, the candles, the completely destroyed omelet. "What is this?" "I'm trying to fix things." "Why?" "Because I should have done it before." "That's not an answer to why you're doing it now." He opened his mouth. She waited. He closed it. She sighed. "That's what I expected," she said. "It's not simple to explain." "Then make the attempt." "We have dinner and candles and apparently all evening." But Nathan looked away, and the silence returned with the particular quality of silence that has something inside it, something pressing against the walls of it, not yet ready to be released. Dinner continued with a strange combination of discomfort and something that bore, against all probability, some resemblance to peace. Nathan asked her questions he had never asked before about her day, her thoughts, the books she was reading, opinions on things he might actually have cared about or might have been practicing caring about, and she couldn't yet tell the difference. Then, tomorrow, would you like to have dinner out? Just the two of us. Clara looked at him across the candles. Are you asking me on a date? I am. We're married. We've never had an actual date. She sat with that for a moment. It was true. There had been an event, a ceremony, a contract. There had never been a date. I'll think about it, she said. Nathan received this like a small, unexpected gift. Later, while Clara was at the kitchen sink and Nathan was visible through the window in the garden, on the phone, the usual gesturing, the usual machinery of his professional life running in the background, he hung up and walked back inside holding something. A white rose, cut from the garden. For you, he said, extending it. Clara looked at it. At him. You cut that from the landscaping. The gardener is going to have a very strong opinion about this. He'll recover. She took the rose and brought it close enough to catch its scent and felt something move inside her, small, tentative, with the quality of something that has been dormant for a long time and is not yet sure whether the conditions are right. Thank you, she said softly. Her phone buzzed on the table. They both looked at it. Clara picked it up. A message from Alex Carter, direct and uncomplicated. He was thinking of her, hoped she was well, and wondering if she had time for coffee. The mood in the kitchen changed its register entirely. Nathan had seen the screen. Clara saw that he'd seen it. It's him again, Nathan said, his voice dropping into something carefully controlled in a way that was itself a tell. Nathan, are you going to answer? I might. I am deciding. What is there to decide? Whether I want to. She set the phone down, her patience arriving at its edge. You cannot manage this, Nathan. You cannot control who I speak to with a combination of jealousy and presumption. I'm not a project. I'm not a subsidiary. I am a person, and I will answer messages from whomever I choose. I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to protect me. You said that. From what exactly? From someone who sent me a polite message. Nathan clenched his hands at his sides, the effort of maintaining his composure visible and not entirely successful. You don't understand what I'm. Then help me understand. Because from where I am standing, you spent 5 years treating me like a very expensive piece of furniture, and now you're behaving like a man who has suddenly discovered he owns something he'd like to keep. And those are not the same thing as loving someone. He grabbed his keys from the counter. I need some air. The door closed behind him with a force that wasn't quite a slam, but made its point clearly enough. Clara stood in the kitchen holding the white rose in one hand and her phone in the other, and felt the old familiar anger and the new, disorienting sadness mixing together in a way that she had no useful category for. Men, she said quietly to the empty kitchen and put the rose in a glass of water. She tried everything. Television, reading, reorganizing a kitchen drawer in a way that required more concentration than it deserved. Nothing held her attention for more than a few minutes. Every time a car passed outside, some involuntary part of her noted it. 10 o'clock. 11. Midnight. She went upstairs but stayed dressed and lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's conversation with the meticulous pointlessness of someone who already knows every line. At 2:15 in the morning, she heard the front door. Footsteps on the marble. A pause. A knock at her door. Clara. She sat up. Come in. He opened the door slowly. He looked like a man who had spent 3 hours in a car, thinking very hard, and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive. His tie was loose. His hair was out of its usual order. His eyes were the most unguarded she had ever seen them. Are you all right? She asked, the worry arriving before she decided to let it. No. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. I'm not. I need to say something. Please let me. Clara pulled her knees up and nodded. Nathan stood in the middle of the room with his hands slightly unsteady and looked at her the way people look at things they have been trying not to look at directly. I drove for 3 hours. I thought if I drove long enough, I'd find a way to make sense of what I'm feeling, to organize it into something manageable. But I can't. A breath. I can't pretend it doesn't matter. What doesn't matter? You. The word came out with a force that wasn't quite controlled. You matter, Clara. You've always mattered. The room was very quiet. I don't, she stopped. Start again. I don't know what to do with that. I know you don't. I know I don't have any right to be standing here, saying this after 5 years of behaving the way I have. He took a step closer, his voice lowering to something raw and unmanaged. I've wanted you since the wedding day. Before that. And I made myself into something cold and unavailable because my father spent my entire childhood teaching me that feeling things was a form of weakness, that love was a liability, that the people who let themselves be vulnerable ended up destroyed. And I believed him. I structured my entire interior life around believing him. Clara looked at her own hands for a moment. You hurt me, Nathan. Every day for 5 years. I know. His voice broke on it. You treated me like I wasn't there. I know. And I'm more sorry for that than I have the vocabulary to express. He crossed to the side of the bed and went down on one knee, taking her hands in both of his. They were warm. That surprised her. She wasn't sure why she had expected them to be cold. Give me a chance, he said. Not because of the contract or the company or any of the external machinery that brought us here. Give me a chance because I want to become the person you deserve from the beginning. I'll earn your trust however long it takes. I'll earn it every day for the rest of my life if that's what it requires. Clara looked at his face. She looked for the performance, for the strategy, for the calculation that she had been conditioned to expect beneath every action he took. What she found instead was a man on the floor of her bedroom at 2 in the morning, hands shaking, saying true things at considerable cost to himself. I don't know yet if I can trust you, she said. I know, and I'm not going to pretend that what you said changes 5 years overnight. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. She looked at their joined hands for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, Go to sleep, Nathan. We'll talk tomorrow. He nodded. He released her hands slowly, as though each finger was a small, separate decision. He stood and looked at her once more with those newly exposed eyes, and left. Clara lay back in the dark and pressed her hands flat against her sternum, where her heart was conducting itself at a tempo it had not achieved in 5 years. She didn't sleep for hours. In the days that followed, Nathan kept his word with the consistency of someone who has made a decision and has no intention of revisiting it. He was at breakfast every morning. He asked about her plans with the genuine interest of someone who actually wanted the answer. He brought flowers, roses from the garden mostly, which the gardener was developing visibly complicated feelings about. He made terrible jokes with the earnest hope of someone who hasn't done it in so long they've lost their form, and most of them made her roll her eyes, and some of them, against her better judgment, made her smile. One morning he appeared in the doorway of the room where she was reading. I need your help. Clara looked up. With what? A proposal. The company is working on a new acquisition, and I want another perspective on the terms before I take it to the board. She lowered the book. My perspective? You studied business. Before we got married. I did, but I haven't. You understand the language, and I trust your judgment. He said it without the quality of compliment, like a simple operational fact. Clara stared at him. You remember that I studied business. Of course I remember. I know quite a lot about you. He paused. I wasn't always paying attention to the right things. That afternoon, she went to his office and sat across from his desk and looked at the documents he spread between them with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for something to focus on. She worked through the terms methodically and found 2 clauses that would have become significant problems within 18 months. Nathan read her analysis, then looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. You're right about both of them. I would have missed the second one entirely. My professor in university used to say that if a risk isn't written down, it doesn't exist yet. He meant you have to write it down yourself before someone else does. Smart man. He was. She closed the folder. You could have hired an analyst for this. I didn't want an analyst. He held her gaze. Thank you, Clara. Genuinely. She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment, her hand on the wall, taking stock of a feeling she hadn't had in years. The sensation of being genuinely, usefully herself in a space where she had previously been merely ornamental. The weeks that followed had a quality she didn't have a word for. The distance that had defined their shared life began to close, not dramatically, but incrementally, the way the temperature changes between seasons. Barely perceptible day to day, and then suddenly different. Nathan was in the same room she was in, and they were the same rooms in a different way than they had been before. He laughed at things she said. He listened when she spoke. He shared things from his day with the new, slightly tentative quality of someone who hasn't done this in a long time and is relearning the form. One night, after a dinner that had lasted 3 hours, because neither of them had noticed the time passing, Nathan looked at her from across the table with an expression that was quiet and direct. I can't remember the last time I felt this, he said. This particular kind of, he paused. At ease. Neither can I, Clara admitted. They were sitting closer than usual on the sofa, the remnants of the evening around them. Nathan reached out and touched her face very gently, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with a tentativeness that was the opposite of everything she'd associated with him. You're beautiful, he said. Her heart moved faster. Nathan, may I? He leaned toward her, giving her time, giving her every exit. And she didn't take any of them. His face came close, his breath warm. And then Clara felt a wave of something she hadn't expected. Not resistance, but a welling of something vulnerable and enormous. And the tears arrived before she could intercept them. Wait, she said, pulling back, her voice unsteady. Please wait. He stopped immediately, his concern so immediate and genuine that it hurt to look at. Did I do something wrong? No, it's not you. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago, and I need to say it now. You can tell me anything. He meant it. That was the thing she was still learning. He meant things now. Clara closed her eyes, found the ground beneath the sentence, and said it. Nathan, I'm still. She took another breath. In 5 years. We never. The words weren't cooperating. I'm still a virgin. The silence that followed was the kind that has a specific texture. She made herself keep going. You never wanted me. You never tried. And I held on to that for 5 years, convinced it meant something was wrong with me. That I wasn't. Her voice fractured. That I wasn't enough to make you want to try. Stop. He reached out and cupped her face gently in both hands, with the kind of care that makes the object of understand they are being held. Please stop. Look at me. She looked at him. It was never about you. Not for a single day. It was my fear, my cowardice, my absolutely spectacular ability to sabotage the things that matter by treating them as threats. He held her face steadily. You are extraordinary, Clara. You've been extraordinary every day of the 5 years I spent failing to say so. And from this moment, I promise you, your timeline, your terms, not 1 inch of pressure. We build this the way you need it to be built. You promise? On everything I have left. When he pulled her into his arms, Clara let go of something she had been holding since before she knew she was holding it. The careful, cultivated architecture of not needing, not expecting, not hoping. She pressed her face into his shoulder and let it go. He held her for a very long time, as though he understood that what was being released had weight. When they finally separated, he wiped her face with his thumbs, and she laughed at herself for crying, and he told her she had absolutely nothing to laugh at herself about. For the record, she said, regaining a slightly steadier register, you were quite a lot of things for 5 years. Blind, emotionally fortified to a clinical degree, constitutionally unavailable. All of those are accurate. I'm glad we can agree. Constitutionally unavailable is particularly precise. Did you workshop that? I had 5 years. He laughed, and it was the most unguarded sound she had ever heard from him, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest like something finding its place. The next morning, the house itself seemed different. Clara came downstairs to the smell of something cooking and found Nathan in the kitchen with a recipe open on the counter and the focused expression of someone who has watched a significant number of instructional videos. "Did you study for this?" she asked, looking at the perfectly golden pancakes on the counter. "I may have spent some portion of last night on YouTube. Seriously, I wanted to produce something that wasn't charcoal." He looked at her sideways, and I was motivated. She took a pancake and bit into it. "Nathan," she paused, "this is genuinely good. I can be taught when I care about the subject." "And what motivated you?" She kept her expression neutral, but her eyes were doing something she knew he could read. "You," he said simply. "Obviously you." She sat down at the kitchen table with her pancake and her coffee and let herself have a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. It was brief and a little alarming and entirely worth it. The days that followed were characterized by a kind of opening that Clara hadn't known she'd been waiting for. Nathan woke early and seemed genuinely to prefer her company to his own. He asked about the books she was reading, the things she thought about, the memories she carried of her mother. He shared for the first time things about his own interior life, the pressure of growing up in his father's version of a family, the specific loneliness of a childhood organized around performance and acquisition, the long, careful process by which he had trained himself to feel nothing, and how thoroughly he now understood that process had failed. "You weren't unfeeling," Clara said one afternoon, while they sat in the garden with the particular ease of people who have stopped performing ease and are simply in it. "You were frightened. I know that now. You should have known it then." "Yes, I should have." He was quiet for a moment. "I've cost us a great deal, Clara." "You have." She held his gaze. "But we're still here." He reached across and laced his fingers with hers, and she let him, and they sat in the afternoon sun like the beginning of something rather than the end. That evening, in a moment of charmed absurdity, the grocery delivery man arrived and smiled at Clara with a perfectly standard professional friendliness. Nathan appeared in the hallway within 30 seconds. "Need any help with those bags?" he asked, with an air of complete innocent helpfulness. "Nathan, he has 2 bags. It's literally his job to carry them." "I know, just being neighborly." The delivery man looked between them with the expression of someone who has stumbled into something he doesn't need to understand. Clara signed for the order and closed the door and turned to face her husband. "You're jealous of the grocery delivery person." "I am helpful." "There's a distinction." "There is not." He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "It's a work in progress. Good thing I have patience." She walked past him toward the kitchen. Deeply tested patience, but patience. One morning, with the directness she had come to associate with his new, less managed self, Nathan said, "I want you to work with me." Clara looked up from the outfit she was selecting. "At the company? You're exceptional at it. I saw the analysis you did on that acquisition proposal. The legal team has been using your notes as a reference point." He leaned against the doorframe. "I want you at the table, Clara, as a real partner. Your knowledge, your judgment, your instincts, all of it." She stood holding a hanger and looked at him for a long moment. The idea was exciting in the specific way that things are exciting when they are also slightly terrifying. "People will say you only gave me the position because I'm your wife. Some people will say that regardless of what you do." "Let them." He held her gaze. "I know what you're capable of, and I'd rather have you working beside me than wondering what we could have built together." "If I do this," she said carefully, "I'm not doing it as your wife. I'm doing it as myself." "That's exactly who I'm asking." Clara set down the hanger. "Then yes, let's try." Her first days at Collins Industries were studied by curious eyes. She was the wife, the mystery, the person people weren't sure how to categorize. She addressed this with a straightforward humor she had always found more effective than formality. When Janet, the executive assistant, hesitated to hand her a stack of contracts, clearly uncertain about the protocol of handing the CEO's wife actual work, Clara said, "Janet, I promise I'm literate. I've been practicing for years." Janet laughed with the quality of someone who has been holding tension and has just been given permission to release it. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Collins." "Clara, please, and overload me." I find paperwork genuinely satisfying, which everyone in my life finds disturbing. Janet became, within 48 hours, an entirely reliable ally. It was while reviewing a collection of archive contracts that Clara found the folder. It was labeled in the neutral, bureaucratic language of documents that want to be overlooked. Bennett Collins merger, confidential. She opened it with the practical interest of someone doing their job. She read the first several pages with the detached efficiency of someone reading operational history. Then she reached clause 3.2, and the detachment began to dissolve. The Bennett heiress agrees to make public appearances at the discretion of the Collins heir in order to strengthen the joint image of the company. At the discretion of. That was why he had never taken her anywhere. She had been an asset to be deployed when useful, stored when not. Clause 4.1. The couple agrees to produce an heir within 5 years from the date of the wedding. Clara's hands had stopped moving on the page. An heir. A deadline. 5 years. She looked at the date on the top of the document, then looked at the calendar on her phone. They were in the 5th year. Clause 4.2. If the previous clause is not fulfilled, the merger will be reevaluated and the companies may choose to dissolve the agreement, including annulment of the marriage. The word annulment sat on the page like something that had been waiting there all along. She turned to the final page. 3 signatures. Her father's, written with the resignation of a man saving what he could from wreckage. Gregory Collins, written with the authority of a man accustomed to writing things that other people had to live by. And Nathan's, firm and unhesitating and exactly like his handwriting always was, certain. The tears arrived without warning or permission, which was the worst kind. She was not a wife. She was a clause. With a countdown. The door opened. Clara, I was thinking we could try that new restaurant tonight. I've heard that Nathan stopped. She stood with the documents in her hands, and he could read the situation in the way people can read the situations that have been waiting to be read. Where did you find that? He said. Does that matter? Her voice was fractured but precise. You signed this, Nathan. This has your signature on it. I am a contractual obligation with an expiration date, and you are in the 5th year, and 5 months ago, you suddenly decided to become a completely different person. Do you see why I might be finding it difficult to sit here and believe that was about love? Clara, it's in writing. She set the documents on the desk with the controlled care of someone who is preventing themselves from throwing them. You can't argue with your own signature. I didn't know about all the clauses. My father handled them, but you signed it. You signed it knowing this marriage was a business arrangement with terms and conditions. Did you read it before you signed? He was silent for a moment too long. Not thoroughly. Then that's its own kind of answer. The tears were coming regardless now. I wanted to believe you. I have been trying so hard to believe you. The breakfast, the terrible omelet, the rose from the garden, the coming to my room in the middle of the night with your hair like that and your voice like that. I wanted all of it to be real. It was real. Or it was a man who suddenly noticed the clock ticking and decided to address a contractual problem with personal charm. She was shaking now. Which version am I supposed to believe, Nathan? Give me a reason. Give me one reason that isn't written in that document. He stepped toward her, and she stepped back with a precision that made the point without a word. Don't. I need to think. I need to be somewhere that isn't this house and this contract in your face while I'm trying to think. Clara, please. You know what the worst part is? Her voice broke on the sentence, and she rebuilt it, word by word. The worst part is that for the first time in 5 years, I started to believe that I was real to you, that I wasn't just an asset on a balance sheet. And now I'm standing in your office holding a document that tells me I was always a line item, and I am genuinely trying to figure out which version of the last 5 months was the truth. Everything I've felt has been real. His voice was urgent and stripped of its usual composure. Everything. I want to believe you, she said, and the grief in it was audible. But I don't know how to right now. I need to go. She walked to the door. He moved to stand in front of it, not blocking, not threatening, just standing the way someone stands when they don't know what else to do. Please don't leave like this. Move, Nathan. He looked at her for a long time. Then he moved. She walked past him and didn't look back, because looking back would have complicated something she needed to keep simple until she understood it better. The hotel room was anonymous in the way that hotels are designed to be, and it was, despite everything, a relief. Clara dropped her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, and then lay down without taking off her shoes and stared at the ceiling while the last 5 months rearranged themselves in the light of what she now knew. Every pancake, every rose, every 2 a.m. conversation and gentle touch and terrible joke and moment of genuine laughter. Was any of it real? Could any of it be real inside the framework of that document? Idiot, she thought, with more tiredness than cruelty. How many times are you going to let yourself be hurt by the same person? Her phone rang. Nathan. She ended the call. It rang again. She ended it again. The third time, she turned the phone off entirely and lay in the silence and let herself be sad without trying to manage the sadness into something more useful. In the mansion, Nathan was not managing anything. He moved between rooms with the specific purposelessness of a man whose organizational capacity has been suspended by something stronger than organizational capacity. He called her number until the voicemail stopped even picking up. He stood in the living room at one point with his phone in his hand and no useful plan. Janet arrived the next morning to find the day's schedule in disarray. She appeared at the office door with the careful expression of someone navigating uncertain ground. Mr. Collins, the board is. Tell them I'm unavailable. Sir, we have 3. Tell them I'm ill. He looked up from the window he had been staring at. If you want me in a boardroom right now, Janet, you will be extremely unhappy with what I do in that boardroom. Leave the schedule. Go home. She left. He remained by the window and thought about what he had signed 5 years ago without reading, and what it had cost, and whether there was any argument left that wasn't purchased. At the hotel, 3 days in, Clara's phone rang again. Not Nathan this time. Alex Carter. She looked at the name and answered. Hello. Clara. His voice had the same warmth it always did, uncomplicated and without agenda. I heard through the industry grapevine that you've been working at Collins. I wanted to call and say well done. That's a big step. It was, she said. Thank you. He caught something in her voice immediately. Are you all right? No, not entirely. Want to talk? Coffee. Somewhere quiet. No expectation of anything except 2 human beings in proximity. She sat on the hotel bed and thought about it. Yes, she said after a moment. I think I would. They met at a small cafe in downtown Los Angeles. The kind of place where the seating is uncomfortable and the coffee is excellent and no one photographs their drinks. Alex was already there, and when he saw her face, he simply said, whatever it is, take your time, and pushed a cappuccino toward her. She didn't tell him everything. She told him enough about the document, about the timeline, about the sick specificity of discovering that you have been a contractual obligation rather than a person. Alex listened the way good people listen, without using the pauses to prepare his responses. When she finished, he said, Can I tell you something you might not want to hear? Please. People make catastrophically poor choices, usually because they're frightened, not because they're malicious. What you've described, a man who grew up being told that feeling things was weakness, who structured his entire life around emotional unavailability, who signed a contract without reading it because he couldn't face the emotional reality of what it meant. That's not a villain. That's someone who was badly formed and is now, possibly, in the process of reforming. He turned his cup in its saucer. The question worth asking isn't whether he made those mistakes. He clearly did. The question is whether what he's doing now is real, or whether it's the contract talking. How am I supposed to know the difference? Sometimes you can't know in advance. Sometimes knowing requires watching what someone does when they have nothing left to gain. Clara looked at her cappuccino. And if he's only here because of the clause, then you'll find out. And you'll be exactly where you are now, which is already a position you've survived. She went back to the hotel that night, feeling less fragmented. Not repaired, not close to repaired, but with the specific clarity that comes from having said true things to someone who received them without motive. She was thinking about what Alex had said, about watching what someone does when they have nothing left to gain, when her phone produced a news alert. She almost scrolled past it. Then she saw the headline. Nathan Collins announces temporary resignation from Collins Industries for personal reasons. She read it 3 times, sitting upright on the hotel bed. Across the city, at the Collins family home, Nathan was standing in front of his father for the first time in a week. Gregory Collins, who had the presence of a man accustomed to filling rooms, looked at his son with an expression that was doing significant work to contain its alarm. "Have you genuinely lost your mind?" His voice had the particular quality of a man who has built something large and is watching someone threaten it with a casual hand. "Stepping down in the middle of European negotiations? You'll destroy everything we've. I don't care about the negotiations." Nathan's voice was very quiet. That specific kind of quiet that is more difficult to argue with in volume. "I care about one thing right now, and the negotiations aren't it. One thing." Gregory looked at him as though he'd started speaking a foreign language. "What one thing is worth?" Nathan met his father's gaze and held it, and the older man saw something there he hadn't seen before. Not defiance, which he knew how to manage, but resolution, which was different. "The woman you turned into a contractual clause. My wife." Gregory opened his mouth. "You made me believe that emotion was weakness," Nathan continued. "You made me believe that love was a liability and vulnerability was a form of suicide, and I was so thoroughly convinced of it that I spent 5 years next to the most remarkable woman I have ever known and treated her like inventory." His voice was even and relentless. "I signed a contract that gave her a deadline. I didn't read it because reading it would have required me to acknowledge what I was doing, and I wasn't ready to acknowledge it. I was protecting the company. You were protecting your portfolio. There is a distinction." Nathan turned toward the door. "I'm returning everything. Every asset that came from the merger. Everything the Bennetts gave up when they needed saving. I'm giving it back." Gregory went genuinely pale. "You can't. I already have a lawyer's emotion." Nathan paused at the door and looked at his father with the particular calmness of someone who has already grieved the version of this conversation they wished they could have. "I should have done this 5 years ago. I should have read the contract and said no and done the difficult, unglamorous work of actually marrying someone. But I didn't. And I've spent the last several months trying to understand how to fix that. And the only place I can find to start is here." He looked at his father steadily. "Goodbye, Dad." He left Gregory Collins alone with his anger and his empire and the particular silence that follows when someone has finally said the true thing at the expense of the convenient one. The following morning, the offices of Harrison and Associates were occupied by lawyers, shareholders, and board members, all attempting to locate, with some urgency, a frame for what was happening. Theodore Harrison, senior partner, placed his glasses on the table and looked at Nathan over them with the expression of a man who has seen many unusual things and is revising his taxonomy. "Mr. Collins, you understand the financial scope of what you're proposing. I understand it precisely. We're discussing in excess of $150 million in transferred assets, possibly considerably more, depending on current valuations. I know how to do arithmetic, Theodore." Howard, a shareholder of the specific type that treats money as a moral system, rose from his chair with the energy of genuine outrage. "This is absolute insanity. You're dismantling years of work because of what?" Nathan's voice remained at the same, even temperature. "Say it, Howard. Because of a marriage? Because of a woman? Because of the human being I turned into a business arrangement?" Howard sat back down with less certainty than he'd risen with. Patricia, one of the more thoughtful board members, spoke quietly from her end of the table. "Does Mrs. Collins know you're doing this?" Nathan looked at his hands. "Not yet, but you're proceeding regardless?" "I'm proceeding regardless. This isn't something I'm doing for her approval. I'm doing it because it's the right thing, and it was wrong from the beginning, and I'm the one who signed my name to it." He picked up the pen Theodore had placed in front of him. Let's continue. The signatures took the better part of the afternoon. Each document transferred something: assets, shares, positions accumulated over years of calculated consolidation. Back to the Bennett family. Back to the starting position before the arrangement that had turned Clara into a clause with an expiration date. When the last document was signed and the lawyers were packing their briefcases with the professional solemnity of people who have witnessed something they aren't quite sure they understand, Nathan sat for a moment alone in the conference room and felt, for the first time in as long as he could identify, something in the vicinity of peace. Theodore lingered at the door. You understand this is going to be a significant media event. I'm aware. Volkov-level coverage. Everyone is going to have something to say. Let them say it. In the hotel room, Clara had been having a more bodily difficult day than she would have chosen. She woke with nausea that she attributed to stress, to the hotel coffee, to the accumulated emotional weight of the past week. But the nausea came back, and came back again. And when she looked at the calendar on her phone with the specific kind of attention that arrives when your body is saying something your mind isn't ready to hear, the dates arranged themselves into an argument she couldn't counter. She went to the pharmacy wearing sunglasses and the general energy of someone who's trying to be invisible and is aware this is not entirely working. The clerk, young and cheerful, said pregnancy test at a volume that made Clara want to reconstruct the foundations of the building. Whatever's fastest, Clara said. Back in the bathroom of her hotel room, she followed the instructions with the concentrated attention of someone who is not ready for either possible outcome and is doing it anyway. 3 minutes. The specific infinity of 3 minutes when you are waiting for something that will rearrange everything regardless of the result. She looked. 2 lines. Clara sat down on the bathroom floor. Not because her legs failed, they didn't, but because sitting seemed like the appropriate response to the world having just reorganized its fundamental priorities without consulting her. She was pregnant. Nathan's child. The man she had left 8 days ago. The man who was simultaneously the person who had hurt her most consistently and the person who had been trying hardest, in his imperfect, lately learned way, to fix it. Oh, she said to the bathroom tiles. This is a lot. The practical questions arrived with the orderly persistence of things that need answering. How to tell him? When? Whether he would see it as leverage, as obligation, as another clause in a contract that already had too many. Whether the child would change everything or just change the surface of everything with the real terrain underneath unchanged. And the question beneath all the other questions, the one she wasn't ready to look at directly, whether what he'd said in her room at 2 in the morning was true, or whether it was a man trying to satisfy the terms of an agreement before the deadline arrived. She sat on a bathroom floor for a while and let herself simply be uncertain without trying to resolve the uncertainty prematurely. Then, later that evening, she was lying on the bed watching television with the distracted attention of someone who is watching something and thinking about something else entirely, when the image on the screen made her sit up. Nathan, at a press conference, behind a podium, surrounded by journalists, looking like a man who had stopped sleeping recently, but had made a decision that was keeping him upright anyway. Clara turned up the volume. I've decided to return all assets acquired by the Collins family through the Bennett-Collins merger back to the Bennett family, he was saying in the even, committed voice she had come to associate with him when he wasn't performing. In full, the room erupted. A journalist. Mr. Collins, that represents a loss of over $150 million. Can you explain the reasoning? Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, some things matter more than money. Such as, he looked into the camera, directly into it, with the quality of someone who knows who they're actually talking to. Love. A breath. I made a series of decisions that were, at their foundation, wrong. I participated in an arrangement that turned a marriage into a business contract and a person into an asset. I did that, and I spent time recently believing that I could make it right while the structure of it, the fundamental dishonesty of it, remained in place. He paused. I was wrong about that too. So I'm starting from the only place I can start from, which is the beginning. Another journalist. What about Collins Industries? What happens to the company? I'll rebuild it. It may take time. It will certainly take a different shape than it had before. But I'd rather build something real slowly than maintain something dishonest quickly. Clara was no longer hearing the subsequent questions. The tears had arrived, warm and without warning, and she let them. He had done it. He had given up the money, not as a gesture, not as a calculated move to demonstrate willingness. He had actually done the legal work and signed the documents and stood in front of cameras and said the honest thing about why. She thought about what Alex had said. Watch what someone does when they have nothing left to gain. Nathan had gained nothing. He had lost considerable things. And he had done it in public, on the record, for no reason that made financial sense. Clara looked at the pregnancy test on the nightstand. Then she looked at Nathan on the screen. Then she got up and found her car keys. The morning had not been kind to Nathan's appearance. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour, in clothes that he'd slept in the specific condition of a person who has been awake too long and is past the point of this being interesting. The mansion was the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but is simply empty. The intercom produced a sound that made him spill the cold coffee. "Mr. Collins, there's someone at the gate. Tell them to go away." "I'm not." "Sir, it's Mrs. Collins." Nathan stood up. The coffee cup fell from the table. He heard it shatter and didn't look down. "Let her in." His voice came out wrong, too urgent, too exposed. He cleared his throat. "Please, let her in." He was at the front door before the car had finished coming up the drive, and he opened it with an energy that was entirely undignified and didn't care about that. And there she was, Clara Bennett Collins, standing in a morning light with a bag over her shoulder and her hair loose and her eyes red in the specific way of someone who has been doing considerable emotional work and present. "Here, real." "Hi," she said. Her voice was unsteady but deliberate. Nathan could not, for a moment, produce anything more sophisticated than that. He was aware of staring at her with more openness than he displayed in 5 years combined. "I watched the press conference." "I know. I hoped you would. I need to talk to you." Her hand moved, almost unconsciously, to rest on her stomach, and Nathan registered the gesture without yet understanding it. "There's a lot to say. Some of it I should have said differently before I left. And some of it," she exhaled, "some of it I just found out." "Come in," he said. "Please, whatever you need." She walked past him into the house, and he closed the door, and for a moment they stood in the entrance hall with 5 years and the last 8 days between them, and both of them knowing the weight of it. They sat on the sofa in the living room, the same sofa where they had laughed over forgotten memories in what felt like a previous chapter, and Nathan gave her the space she needed without filling it. "You actually did it," Clara said, looking at her hands. "The money, the signatures. I kept waiting for there to be an asterisk somewhere. A footnote. There isn't one." "I know. I looked." She looked up at him. "I had a lawyer friend check the documents. It's real. It's real." She was quiet for a moment. "I found those contracts in your office. The merger documents. I read clause 4.2. "I know. Did you know about that clause when you signed?" "No. Truthfully, I didn't read the document carefully. I signed it the way I signed most things my father put in front of me, which was without enough attention and with the assumption that his interests and mine were aligned. They weren't." He held her gaze. "But that's not an excuse. I should have read it. I should have refused it, or insisted on changes, or had the courage to say that this isn't how two people should begin a marriage." "In the last 5 months," Clara said carefully, "the breakfast and the flowers and the apology at 2 in the morning. Was any of that because the deadline was approaching?" Nathan was silent for a moment. "Then, when I look at the timeline, I understand why you'd ask that. And I can't give you proof that would satisfy someone who's determined not to be satisfied." He looked at her directly. "What I can tell you is that when I saw you at that gala, when I saw you alive in a room, being yourself with someone who was actually paying attention to you, what I felt wasn't panic about a contract. It was grief. Grief for the 5 years I'd wasted and fear that I was about to lose the only person who had ever genuinely disrupted my self-imposed equilibrium. Clara looked at him for a long time. Nathan, there's something else. Her hand returned to her stomach. I found out yesterday. He looked at her hand, then at her face, then back at her hand, and the understanding moved through him slowly, like something waking up. Yes. The word he didn't say landed in the room anyway. Yes. Nathan's breath left him. He sat completely still for a full 3 seconds that seemed considerably longer. Then he slid from the sofa to the floor, covering his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. Nathan. Clara reached toward him, uncertain. Are you? He looked up. He was crying and smiling, and the combination was something she had never seen on his face before because it required the absence of all performance, and this was the first time she had seen him entirely without it. We're going to have a baby, he said, and his voice was broken into pieces by something that was not sorrow. Clara, we're going to be parents. I know. It's everything. He reached forward and took her hands, and then he was on his knees in front of her and crying openly and laughing at the same time with the pure, unmanaged release of someone for whom too many things have been true simultaneously. It's the most he couldn't finish. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands for a moment, gathering himself. We're going to have a child. Clara pulled him up toward her and held him, and he held her, and they stayed that way on the living room floor for a long time. She felt his shoulders shaking and then steadying, and her own tears came and went and came back. I was so afraid to tell you, she said into his shoulder. I was afraid you'd think it was a trap, or that you'd stay because of obligation. No. He pulled back enough to look at her. Clara, listen to me. I was here before I knew about this. The press conference happened before you called. The documents were signed before you came back. I did none of that because I knew. I did it because it was the only honest thing left to do. He held her face in his hands. I'm not here for the baby. The baby is... He stopped, overwhelmed again. The baby is extraordinary, and I already can't breathe thinking about it. But I'm here for you. I have always been here for you in the only way I knew how, which for a very long time was a terrible way, and now I'm learning a better one. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment with the full, unguarded attention of someone deciding something irreversible. I believe you, she said. He exhaled like he'd been holding it since she left. They sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, and talked. Nathan talked about his father, about growing up in the specific loneliness of a family that treated love as a strategic liability. He talked about signing the contract and the particular cowardice of not reading it, of choosing not to know because knowing would have required feeling something about it. He talked about the gala and the moment he'd understood, watching her laugh with someone who was simply paying attention to her, that the thing he'd been protecting himself from had already happened, that he loved her and had probably loved her since before he'd had the language for it, and that he had been losing her by increments for 5 years without the courage to stop it. Clara talked about what it had been like. The careful architecture of not needing. The practiced self-sufficiency of someone who has been told, through 5 years of absence, that she is not worth showing up for. The specific grief of loving a house and a marriage that were both missing their essential person. I don't want compensation, she said, when he had finished apologizing for the 4th time. I want partnership. I want honesty. I want to be your actual wife in all the ways that means in good faith. That's all I want to give you. He paused, and also to wrap you in protective padding for the next 8 months. Nathan, I know, but you're carrying our child, and the stairs in this house are 47 steps, and I've been thinking about hand railings. You've been thinking about hand railings and non-slip mats. I've been gone 8 days. I had a lot of time to think. Clara looked at him and felt the laugh arrive before she could contain it. Not the polite, managed laugh she'd spent 5 years performing in rooms full of people who didn't know her, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine. You're going to be absolutely impossible, she said. Almost certainly, and I'm going to be frustrated with you regularly. I expect so. And I love you. The words came out before she'd consciously sent them, with the simplicity of something that had been true for a while and was only now finding its moment. I love you, Nathan Collins. Despite your considerable list of historical failings and your apparent belief that hand railings are an appropriate response to pregnancy. He was very still for a moment, taking it in. Then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, softly, unhurriedly, with none of the former 5 years' distance and all of the last 5 months' careful learning, and Clara let herself be in it without looking for the exit. When he stood up and disappeared upstairs with an urgency that seemed distinct from the moment they'd just had, she called after him. "Where are you going?" "Wait there," came the answer, accompanied by the sounds of drawers being opened. He returned, slightly breathless, holding a small box. Clara's eyes recognized what it was before her mind had fully arrived at the conclusion. "Nathan." He went on one knee, and she was so surprised that she laughed, and he didn't stop. "Clara Bennett Collins," he said, and his voice was steady in the way it was only when he meant something completely. "5 years ago, I married you for every reason except the right one. I married you for money and strategy, and because my father told me it was what the company needed. And I spent 5 years failing to understand that what I actually had was the right person and the wrong approach." He opened the box. A simple ring, white gold, a single stone that caught the light without demanding it. "I want to start over. Not with a new person, with you exactly as you are, exactly as we are, but with the right intention. I want you to stay because you want to, not because of a contract, not because of a clause, because you choose to." She looked at the ring, at his face, at the man who had gotten so many things wrong and had, when the moment required it, gotten the most important thing exactly right. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. For real this time." His hands were shaking as he slid the ring on her finger, enough that she had to hold his hand steady to help. When it was in place, he pulled her forward and held her in the kind of embrace that is also an apology and a promise and a relief all at once. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, "for coming back, for giving me this. Thank you," she said quietly, "for finally being worth coming back to." 3 months later, Clara was unmistakably, visibly, gloriously pregnant, and Nathan had become precisely as impossible as she had predicted, with a devotion to the cause that would have been alarming if it weren't so completely genuine. "I'll get that," he said, reaching for the light bag she was carrying. "Nathan, it's my handbag. You're carrying our child. That's sufficient weight for one person. I'm also carrying my phone and a lipstick. I think I'll manage. I bought a book on the physics of weight distribution in pregnancy." "You did not." "I did. Chapter 4 is very clear on the subject." Janet, who had witnessed 17 consecutive versions of this conversation from the office doorway, allowed herself a smile that she felt was professionally appropriate given the circumstances. Collins Industries had restructured. It was smaller now, leaner, built on a different foundation than the one Gregory Collins had constructed. Nathan had started over in the way that people start over when they mean it. Not with a dramatic rebranding, but with the quiet, daily work of doing things differently. One afternoon, Clara was reviewing documents in the conference room when Nathan knocked and came in with the expression of someone carrying news that is significant in multiple directions simultaneously. "Jonathan Price called," he said. "The one from Zurich?" "The one from Zurich. He has a proposition." Nathan sat down across from her. "A sustainable technology startup. Renewable energy infrastructure for underserved communities. The initial investment is considerable. The return timeline is long, and the social impact is significant," Clara said, reading his expression. "Yes, and he wants you involved. He wants us involved." Nathan held her gaze across the table. "As co-founders." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a big word. Co-founders. I know. You've never done anything in the actual founding sense. You've always come in after the hard part. Also true. And you want to start with sustainable energy in underserved communities, which is, objectively, more complicated than most things you've attempted." "Yes." Clara looked at him. "What would we call it?" I had a thought about that. He seemed slightly nervous, which was a state she had come to find both endearing and informative. Bennett and Collins International Consulting. She raised an eyebrow. Me first. You first. She was quiet for long enough that he was starting to look genuinely uncertain. Then, I'll say yes on one condition. Anything. No more contracts that I'm not involved in drafting. Done. I mean it, Nathan. Every agreement, every clause, every document with both our names on it. I read it before anyone signs. Agreed. Completely. Then yes. She extended her hand across the table in the formal, deliberate way of someone establishing a partnership. Let's build something. He took her hand and shook it, and then held it, and looked at her with the expression she had been watching develop for months now. Open and certain and full of a happiness that he seemed still slightly surprised by, as though he kept expecting it to be withdrawn. Their first office was 3 modest rooms in a downtown building that smelled of fresh paint and ambition in approximately equal measures. This is very small, Clara observed, on their first morning, standing in what would generously be described as the main conference room. It's ours. There are 6 chairs in here, and they're all touching each other. Cozy. Nathan, if everyone on the team breathes simultaneously, we're going to have a structural problem. It's a beginning, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly with the careful reverence that still undid her a little every time. Everything starts somewhere small. Clara covered his hands with hers and looked out the window at the downtown street below, at the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely sufficient view of a city going about its business. All right, she said. Let's begin. The early months of Bennett and Collins were what Nathan later described as organized creative chaos, and what Clara described, more accurately, as chaos with spreadsheets. They built the business model in late evenings around Clara's increasingly prominent pregnancy, argued productively about expansion timelines, and discovered the specific comedy of 2 people with strong, competing instincts trying to govern a shared enterprise. You're too conservative, Clara said during one memorable board session that consisted of just the 2 of them. You're too aggressive, Nathan replied. I prefer the term ambitious. And I prefer the term measured. They looked at each other across the table. We're going to have this argument a lot, Clara observed. Almost certainly. I'm going to be right more often than you. I'm going to be right about the things that matter. They stared at each other for a moment of genuine impasse. Then Clara laughed, and Nathan followed, and Janet appeared in the doorway to see if everything was all right and received the jointly delivered answer. Functionally dysfunctional. It's fine. By the time Clara reached her 8th month, the company had secured its first major international partnership. Nathan had developed what their colleagues had privately begun calling a graduate-level system of protective protocols, and Clara had made clear on multiple occasions, and with increasing specificity, that if he suggested she take the elevator for 3 floors one more time, she would be discussing it with the press. The morning of the meeting with the international investors, Clara woke with what she categorized as tension and Nathan categorized as a concerning pattern of symptoms that he was extremely careful not to say out loud. By 10 o'clock, the discomfort had developed a rhythmic quality that she continued to characterize as tension. By noon, she had identified it as something else and was keeping the identification to herself until after the presentation. The meeting started at 2. Clara presented the 3rd quarter projections with the focused precision of someone who has prepared thoroughly and is also, quietly, managing something else simultaneously, until a contraction that was not possible to quietly manage arrived mid-sentence. She paused, breathed, continued. Mrs. Bennett, one of the investors, leaned forward with visible concern. Are you quite all right? Perfectly. She smiled with what she felt was remarkable composure, given the circumstances. Where were we? 2nd year projections. Another contraction. Harder. Clara gripped the table edge. Nathan was looking at her with the expression of someone who has read 11 books about pregnancy and is currently watching Chapter 9 begin in real time. Clara, he said. Keep going, she said through slightly clenched teeth. Clara. Nathan, We are in a meeting. Your water just broke." The silence in the conference room had a very particular quality. Clara looked down, then at Nathan, then at the table of investors who were, to their credit, being very composed. "Right," she said. So it did. What followed was, by any reasonable measure, the most efficiently organized crisis the company had yet encountered, largely because everyone in the building except Nathan handled it competently. Janet produced towels from somewhere. Daniel was already on the phone with the hospital. The investors, 3 countries represented between them, offered assistance in their respective languages simultaneously. Nathan had gone the color of good quality typing paper and appeared to have briefly lost access to sequential reasoning. "Nathan," Clara said. "The baby," he said. "The presentation." "The car," she said. "Now." This was sufficient. Nathan picked her up, carried her to the elevator, and was 3 steps down the hall before he remembered he'd left his keys on the conference table. He retrieved them at something approaching a sprint while Clara stood in the hallway being attended to by Janet, who had everything in hand. "The investors," Nathan said, returning. "We'll reschedule," Clara said. "Car." They went. The drive was eventful. Nathan used the horn of his car with an enthusiasm that suggested he felt it was a morally necessary tool rather than an optional one. "You nearly clipped that cyclist," Clara said. "I saw the cyclist. You were looking at me. I could do both." "Nathan, I am the one in active labor. You don't get to be the one who's frightened." "I'm not frightened," he said, with exactly the quality of voice that means the opposite. At the hospital entrance, he jumped out and forgot to turn off the engine. A nurse reminded him. He turned it off, handed the keys to a valet with the expression of a man operating on instinct, and was back at Clara's side in 11 seconds. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "You were gone for 11 seconds. It was too long." Nurse Linda, who had seen everything in 30 years of obstetrics and yet found the arrival of Nathan Collins somehow fresh, took charge with the comfortable authority of someone who was born for exactly this. She positioned him in a chair, produced water, and said, "Mr. Collins, breathe." "I am breathing." "You are hyperventilating. There's a distinction." 2 minutes later, he was sitting with his head between his knees. Clara, between contractions, was laughing. "You practiced breathing techniques for 3 months," she said. "You bought audio programs." "Practice," Nathan said from somewhere near the floor, "is not the same as the actual thing." Dr. Harrison arrived with the calm energy of someone for whom this is simply Tuesday. "We have a determined baby and an equally determined father," she said, looking at Nathan with the tone of someone who has a bucket nearby as a precaution. What followed was 6 hours in which Clara was, as Nathan would later say at every opportunity, the most extraordinary person he had ever had the privilege of witnessing. She managed the labor with the same combination of humor and precision she brought to everything, making jokes between contractions, squeezing Nathan's hand with a force that made him understand things about pain in a new and personal way, and generally doing the most significant physical work of her life while simultaneously making everyone in the room feel better about being there. "If I get through this," she said at one point, "you owe me immunity from any complaint for a minimum of 10 years. Every complaint. Eternal immunity. I'm putting that in writing. Whatever you need." And then, in a moment that seemed to fold time around itself, Dr. Harrison announced that it was time, and Nathan held her hand and told her she was extraordinary and capable and astonishing and a few other things that Clara could not later recall specifically, but remembered as feeling entirely true, and Clara pushed, and the room filled with a sound that was the best sound either of them had ever heard. "It's a boy," Dr. Harrison said. Nathan made a sound he had never made before and would have been embarrassed by if he had been the person he was 6 months ago. He was not that person anymore. The baby was placed on Clara's chest, small and red-faced, and new and the most real thing she had ever held. She looked at that tiny face and felt her heart rearrange itself around a new center of gravity. "Hi," she said very quietly. "We've been waiting for you." Nathan was kneeling beside the bed, one finger being gripped with startling strength by a hand the size of a small apricot. He was crying with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has run out of any interest in managing how they appear. "He's perfect," Nathan said. "Clara, he's absolutely perfect. What should we call him?" Nathan looked at his son, at Clara, at the room around them that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something he didn't have a word for, something that was the particular atmosphere of an important beginning. "Henry," he said. "Henry James Collins." "Henry." Clara said the name to the face that was looking at her with the unfocused intensity of someone encountering everything for the first time. "Henry Collins. Welcome." Henry Collins did not appear to have any particular objections to the name. Nurse Linda, who had witnessed hundreds of arrivals, wiped her eyes with an efficiency that suggested she had done this before but found it undiminished regardless. "Welcome to parenthood," Dr. Harrison said, with the warm pragmatism of someone who loves her job. "Prepare to be consistently surprised and chronically underslept." "I'd do this 1,000 times over," Nathan said, not taking his eyes off his son. "Check back in at 3 a.m., Clara said, and he laughed, and it was the best sound in the room, which was already full of good sounds. The months that followed were the most demanding and the most fundamentally joyful of either of their lives. Henry Collins was small and urgent and opinionated from the beginning, and the house that had once been defined by its silences was now organized around the sounds he made and the needs he had and the extraordinary democracy of a baby's requirements, which make no distinction between CEO and waitress, between wealth and nothing, between what you thought your life was going to be and what it turned out to be instead. Bennett and Collins thrived in the particular way that organizations thrive when the people running them are working from genuine purpose rather than strategic calculation. The investors who had been present at Henry's dramatic entrance to the world sent flowers and became, as they later described it, personally invested in the company's success in a way that went beyond the financial. If a company could manage a crisis like that with grace, they said it could manage anything. Gregory Collins became, against all prior indications, a devoted grandfather. He came every Sunday, without exception, always with something for Henry, always with the particular quality of a man who is trying to become a better version of himself in the time remaining. His relationship with Nathan was not simple, and they had not pretended it was. But it was real. It was improving. It was worth the work. On Henry's first birthday, the garden was full of the people who had actually been present for the story. Janet and Daniel, who had become the kind of colleagues who were essentially family. A handful of Clara's friends from before and after. The small, genuine collection of people who had witnessed the various chapters and were here for this one. Henry, with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise eyes, sat in his high chair and applied himself to his birthday cake with the comprehensive commitment of someone who has discovered something important. "He definitely inherited your approach to things you love," Nathan said, photographing the destruction. "He's decisive," Clara said. "It's a quality. Decisive. Is that what we're calling it? Would you prefer passionate?" "I'd prefer clean," Nathan said, and Clara threw a napkin at him, and Henry laughed at the napkin, and the afternoon went on. Later, when the light had shifted to the particular gold of late afternoon and the guests had settled into the comfortable noise of people who were genuinely happy to be in the same place, Nathan held out his hand to Clara. "Dance with me." "Here? In the garden?" "Exactly here. In the garden. Right now." She took his hand. They danced on the grass in the way that people who are not natural dancers dance when they don't care about that. A little awkward, a little slow, entirely themselves. Henry watched from his grandmother's lap with the absorbed attention of someone who hasn't seen dancing before and is deciding what to think about it. "I've done a lot of things wrong," Nathan said quietly, as they moved together in the imperfect afternoon light. "Significant things. For a long time." "You have," Clara agreed. "But I ended up here. We ended up here." She rested her head briefly on his chest. "We built it. Together. Badly at first, and then better. And we'll keep building. Every day." Henry said something from Eleanor's lap, a sound that was not yet words but was clearly directed at them, clearly wanting to be included. They both looked over. Henry was reaching toward them with both hands, the universal infant signal for I would like to be part of whatever this is. They broke apart and walked over, each taking one small hand, and the three of them stood in the garden in the late afternoon sun while Gregory Collins, from the edge of the gathering, raised his camera and captured something he would keep for the rest of his life. His son and his son's wife and his grandson, bathed in light and laughter, looking for all the world like people who have arrived somewhere they were always meant to be. Clara looked around at the garden that had once been a beautiful and empty space and was now a place where things happened, at the man beside her who had taken so long to become himself, at the boy between them who was entirely new and entirely theirs, at the evidence of a life that had been built rather than arranged. She leaned close to Nathan and said, quietly enough that it was only for him, "We are what we were meant to be, right from the beginning. We just took the long way." Nathan pressed his lips to her temple. Henry laughed at something only he could see. Somewhere in the garden, someone was singing along to the music playing from the outdoor speakers, off-key and entirely unself-conscious about it. "A family," Nathan said. "The best kind," Clara replied. "The real kind." And the afternoon went on, and the city carried them forward into evening, and the story, which had taken such a long time to find its proper beginning, continued from there.